So Microsoft has been pretty adamant on calling the Xbox Series X the most responsive console ever. I first noticed it when I was going through all of their blog posts and spec sheets, and the name just kept popping up. So in this video, I wanted to quickly explain why they're calling it that. First off, what exactly does responsive mean? Well, in regard to Xbox Series X, Microsoft is referring to latency, or rather input latency. And for those of you guys who don't know exactly what latency is, here's a quick breakdown. Every time you press a button on your controller or keyboard, your console, PC, and display device don't instantaneously respond to your command. The signal containing your command either has to travel through a cable or through the air in the form of an electromagnetic wave. And once it gets to your console, the information then needs to be processed and a corresponding image must be generated, which also takes time. The image is then sent to your display, and your display needs to process the information before it's able to present it, which again takes more time. By the time this entire process is wound up and completed, the elapsed time between button press and display on the monitor could range from anywhere in between 30 and 120 milliseconds on average, or 0.03 and 0.12 seconds, so decently fast. And for the most part, unless you're a competitive gamer, this wouldn't be noticeable to you. But let's say for a second that you're gaming on a cheap display or that your controller doesn't have a very good connection to your console. The time between button press and presentation could increase significantly, which would not be ideal for gaming. I mean, sure, something like a 0.15 second input latency may not seem bad for gaming, but it's really just one piece of the puzzle, because if you're playing an online multiplayer game and your ping is pretty high, let's say 120 milliseconds, all of a sudden your reaction time will be slowed to over a quarter second. And in most games that are dependent on a fast latency, that's usually more time than you need to be killed. So having a fast input latency becomes crucial for performing well. And enter Microsoft. They've introduced two new technologies that aim to make input latency as low as possible for all players, regardless of what devices you're using. The first of which is called Auto Low Latency Mode. This is a feature that will ship with Xbox this holiday and basically allow the console to detect what TV or monitor you've plugged it into and automatically change your display settings to game mode if it has one. And typically what game mode does is it basically sacrifices either a bit of color accuracy or refresh rate in order to ensure the processing time that happens within the display is as low as possible, thus decreasing your input latency. And don't worry, the loss in color accuracy or refresh rate shouldn't be much noticeable to you at all. Those are the kind of things you'd probably be more concerned with if you were a competitive gamer or intense moviegoer. And for those of you guys who may not know what refresh rate is, it's basically how many images your display can show in 1 second, and it's not to be confused with frame rate, which is how many images your console can render a second. But fun fact, generally speaking, refresh rate reigns supreme since you can only display as many frames as your refresh rate allows. So let's say that this monitor's refresh rate is being visually represented by this pulse. So every time you see that blue pulse, we can assume that the monitor has just refreshed its image. We could also say that this console is rendering more frames than the display can refresh and sending them all over to the display anyway. This will sadly create what we PC players call dropped frames, or discarded frames that missed their timings and sadly never got a chance to be displayed. So now you might be thinking, damn, low refresh rates suck. And you'd be 100% correct on that. When you have a low refresh rate monitor, your console or graphics card will basically be working in overdrive for a difference that won't ever be displayed. And just in case you were curious, if your refresh rate is higher than your frame rate, you will experience something we PC players call repeated frames, where a single frame is displayed multiple times by your monitor until it receives the next frame from your console or graphics card. And I'm pretty sure we all know what the extreme case of this looks like if you've ever had a poor performing game before, though not all instances of repeated frames will look this bad, or anywhere near it for that matter. The industry standard for display refresh rates right now is 60 Hz or 60 refreshes per second, but with news that both new consoles will be able to handle 1080p gaming at frame rates upward of 120, I thought I might as well explain this concept since most of you guys are probably gaming on 60 Hz monitors and might want to consider upgrading to truly see the difference in frame rates on your shiny new consoles. Cause I know a lot of console players would be like, 120 FPS is not that good, I don't know why PC players made such a big deal about it, while not knowing that they're gaming on a 60 Hz display. And no shots towards you guys watching this video, you guys are cool. My gaming monitor has a refresh rate of 144 Hz if you happen to be curious, but I know now they're making monitors with refresh rates of 240 Hz 1080p, which is honestly just overkill and really isn't needed. So next time you go display shopping, just keep that in the back of your head. But mini tangent aside, that's what auto low latency mode is. If your TV supports it, your Xbox will get plugged in and do all the heavy lifting for you, changing whatever settings it needs to on your TV to ensure that your gaming experience is as smooth and as responsive as possible. well, again either sacrificing a slight bit of color accuracy or refresh rate depending on your display. And this is to make sure that the processing time that happens within your display is as low as possible, and I wouldn't worry too much about the slight losses, as in most cases they're pretty negligible. The Xbox will also switch your TV back to its original settings once you turn it off, which is pretty neat. But now onto the second aspect of Xbox's response technology, known as dynamic latency input, or DLI for short. Now, if you guys have ever played Minecraft, this part should be relatively easy to explain. In Minecraft, and in all games for that matter, there is something called a simulation and render loop rate, or tick rate in gamer lingo terms. And a tick rate can kind of be likened to the refresh rate of a display that I just explained earlier, as in a tick rate is the amount of times a second that a game engine checks for updates, which are things like movement, explosions, or literally anything. And these updates could come from you as the player, i.e. moving a little, or from the game code itself, like water flowing. Tick rates essentially simulate the passage of time, hence the terminology tick rate. For games like Minecraft, which don't really focus on precision, they'll have low tick rates like 20 Hz or 20 ticks a second. Every time the game ticks, it checks whether or not a zombie was supposed to growl, a piece of TNT was supposed to explode, or if you as the player placed an input that needs to be represented on screen. You can think of a tick rate as a game's refresh rate, or the amount of times a second that the game will update based on new information. If you want an example of how this might affect your gameplay, then you can look no further than lagging online. If you've ever been lagged back to a prior position even though you've been moving forward for upwards of 10 seconds, this is usually due to the game's server-side computer not receiving any of your updates on position. So if you've been moving forward for upwards of 10 seconds and all of a sudden a successful command is finally sent through, but you also happen to be nowhere near where the last tick command was successfully sent, the game server activates a soft anti-cheat that just resets you back to where your last successful command was confirmed, because obviously from their perspective they don't want you teleporting at what seems to be like one tick, while on somebody else's screen you're pretty much frozen in place like an idiot because your computer doesn't want to send any successful updates. But to continue, if you happen to get unlucky as the player, you could for instance place a command in between ticks, meaning that you'd be stuck waiting until the next tick before the game could even begin processing your command. And depending on how fast your game's tick rate is, the industry standard right now is 60 Hz or 60 ticks per second, this wait in between ticks could add anywhere in between 1 and 5 milliseconds of additional latency time to your gaming experience. Enter Microsoft's Dynamic Latency Inputs, or DLI, a technology whose goal is to simply attempt to synchronize controller inputs with gaming tick rates as best as possible, making sure you don't send commands in between ticks and bringing you as responsive of an experience as it can. And honestly, it's pretty cool when you think about it. Essentially, that is why the Xbox Series X is being claimed by Microsoft as the most responsive console ever. And I'm not entirely sure as to whether or not the PS5 will have the same feature set or if they plan to tackle latency in a completely different way. Because in my efforts to make this a comparison video, I've looked high and low across the internet and couldn't manage to find a single piece of credible information about what the PS5's take on latency is and how Sony plans to handle it. I was hoping that they would have released some latency information about the new DualSense controller by now, but sadly not. I guess only time will tell what Sony's methods are and whether or not they plan to implement similar features. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, folks. If you liked it, leave a like, and if you disliked it, dislike, and feel free to let me know why in the comments. Anyways, I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.